This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about a system that has started confusing power with capacity. And that confusion is how economies crack. Because somewhere inside the machinery of trade, a request was made for something physical, not symbolic, not rhetorical, heavy equipment, the kind of equipment you cannot conjure with a speech. And the answer was one word: no, not later, not maybe, not let's talk, just no. And if that feels small, it's because we've been trained to think the real action happens in headlines. But the real action is happening in supply lines, in contracts, in warehouses, in lead times measured in months. Stay with me. Subscribe if you want the next pieces as they land, because what looks like a simple refusal is actually a stress test. And it's already failing in places you don't see yet. And here's the part you're going to want to understand next. Who or what actually gets to say no now? Something is controlling the system now. And it is not popularity. It is not bravado. It is not even ideology. It's scarcity, not the dramatic kind, not empty shelves, the quiet kind, the kind that hides inside spreadsheets and shipping schedules, the kind that only becomes visible when someone tries to jump the line. Because this is what the modern economy really is. It's not a pile of stuff. It's a sequence, a chain of promises, contracts stacked on contracts, delivery windows aligned like gears. And when you hear that a major demand was made for heavy machinery, equipment worth tens of billions, built mostly outside the United States, already locked into long-term supply, what you're really hearing is this: someone tried to convert political pressure into physical priority, and the system answered with physics. No. And that's the frame. Not personality, not drama. The real fight is over who gets the last available unit, the next shipping slot, the remaining inventory, before the slowdown becomes a spiral. Hold on to that, because once scarcity becomes governance, every ask becomes a threat, and every no becomes a weapon. And that takes us to the shift that made this possible. The shift that was so slow, we barely noticed it happening. There was a time when the United States treated supply as something it could assume, not because it was perfect, because it was stable enough to ignore. Before the system had slack, warehouses had buffers, inventories existed as insurance. If one supplier delayed, another filled the gap. If costs rose, it hurt, but it didn't destabilize. Now the entire structure runs like a tightrope. A single specialized machine can take 12 to 24 months to build. A single high-capacity excavator or turbine transporter can cost $5 million. And over 68% of the specialized industrial machinery used in U.S. megaprojects is imported. That means demanding it faster doesn't create more machines. It just forces someone else to wait, or collapse, or default. And here's what changed quietly over years. We normalized dependence. We normalized the idea that critical capacity would live elsewhere, under someone else's labor constraints, energy prices, and domestic priorities. So when someone tries to override that reality with urgency, months, not years, the system doesn't bend. It reveals its true hierarchy. And that's the danger of slow change. It doesn't announce itself, it becomes normal. Until the day it becomes leverage. Because in the world you're living in now, the most powerful actor isn't the loudest. It's the one holding the bottleneck. And in the next part, we hit the first shock, one concrete symptom that shows you exactly how close this is to your life. You want a concrete symptom? Fine. Let's pick the one that looks like a commodity story until you see what it's actually doing to the country. U.S. aluminum prices have surged 40% since June 2026, record highs, above $5,200 per metric ton. And while that number sounds like finance channel noise, the inventory numbers are the real alarm. American aluminum inventories collapsed from 750,000 tons at the start of 2025 to below 300,000 tons today, a 60% drop in 12 months. That is not a market fluctuation. That is a system running out of oxygen. The Midwest aluminum premium hit a record 96 cents per pound, up 65% since June. Construction firms are reporting delays and cost overruns. Projects stall, timelines slip, and when timelines slip, workers don't just lose time, they lose paychecks. This is where the machinery demand stops being weird and starts being logical. If your inputs are vanishing and your projects are bleeding, you start trying to pull anything you can forward. Equipment, shipments, priority. And then you hit the wall. Canada, which supplies 70% of nearly 4 million tons of U.S. aluminum imports, has stopped discretionary shipments because they're losing money under a 50% tariff structure. And here is your cliff. Once discretionary shipments stop, the next thing that stops is not trade. It's jobs. So let's open the machine room. Because if you don't understand the mechanism, you'll keep thinking these are separate crises. They're not. Here's the mechanism. Tariffs can change price. They cannot instantly change capacity. When the aluminum tariffs doubled to 50% in June 2025, the stated goal was simple: push investment into local U.S. production, reduce dependence. But aluminum smelters don't appear because a leader wants them. They take years. They take billions. They take energy infrastructure and permitting and labor and supply chains of their own. Meanwhile, American industry still needs aluminum now for cars, planes, buildings, packaging. So Canadian exporters ran the math. Under the tariff structure, they couldn't profitably ship into the U.S. The premium Americans were paying didn't fully cover the duty. And so Canada did the most rational thing in a system that worships rationality. They redirected shipments to other markets. That's it. That's the hinge. The shortage isn't mystical. It's a reroute, a decision made on a spreadsheet that becomes a crisis on a factory floor. And once inventories collapse, everything downstream starts panicking. Contractors bid blind, manufacturers hoard, insurers raise risk premiums, markets price fear, not fundamentals. This is how scarcity becomes policy without any vote. And now you can see why a demand for heavy machinery wasn't random. It was a desperate attempt to outrun a bottleneck. But the next part is where desperation becomes acceleration, because the second shock is faster, sharper, and it doesn't stay contained. Now watch how quickly this speeds up when the system realizes the bottleneck is real. One shipment delays, then another. Then a schedule slips by a week, then a month. And suddenly the problem isn't high prices, it's stoppage. A plant that depends on machinery delivery doesn't adjust, it idles. 300 workers, 500 workers, temporarily, until temporarily becomes indefinite. A contractor with a fixed-price contract doesn't ride it out. Penalties stack, margins evaporate, credit lines tighten. One late machine turns into layoffs, and the price signals get louder. Not because the metal changed, because the fear did. The Midwest premium is 96 cents a pound. People in the industry are saying it should be closer to 86. That gap, that's not cost. That's panic, and panic is contagious. Logistics insurers adjust risk premiums. Infrastructure firms see shares dip. Analysts start modeling retaliation scenarios because once trade becomes coercion, everyone starts preparing for the moment it stops being trade at all. You can feel the system tightening. No slack, no buffer. Everything becomes a fight over timing. And this is the crucial point. The first crisis was aluminum. The second crisis is trust, because when contracts stop being treated as contracts, when political pressure tries to override the queue, every supplier starts building defenses. And that brings us to you, not as an observer, as a participant, because you are inside the blast radius whether you voted for it or not. Let me make this personal because it already is. You don't buy aluminum. You buy the consequences of aluminum. You buy the delays. You buy the premiums. You buy the cancellations hidden behind polite corporate language. When a commercial building project needs aluminum framing and the price jumps 40% in 6 months, that cost doesn't vanish. It moves. It passes from supplier to contractor to developer to tenant to you. If you're renting, it shows up in higher prices. If you're renovating, it shows up in quotes that expire in days, because nobody can secure materials at predictable costs. If you work in construction or manufacturing, it shows up as schedule chaos, shifts cut, lines slowed, temporary idling. Small firms can't absorb this. Tight margins, fixed bids, limited capital. A roofing company locked into a contract 6 months ago doesn't get to rewrite reality. They either eat the loss or risk breach. Some will go bankrupt. And while that's happening, someone else is benefiting. Higher prices reward the players positioned to sell into shortage conditions, even as the broader economy loses stability. If you're still watching, subscribe, because this isn't just a story about trade. It's a story about how quickly your life gets priced by forces you never voted on. And now we widen the lens because the ripple doesn't stop at the border. The border is where it starts. Here's what makes this dangerous internationally. Everyone is watching the precedent. European trade officials emphasize contract integrity for a reason. If political demands can reorder industrial supply, then every contract becomes provisional. And in global trade, provisional contracts are poison. Asian suppliers are watching too, because if one powerful buyer tries to override existing commitments today, every supplier has to assume they'll be pressured tomorrow. And the rational response to pressure is diversification. More buyers, more options, fewer dependencies. That's how fragmentation happens, not with a speech, with 1,000 defensive decisions. And then there's Canada. Canada is not just a neighbor. Canada supplies nearly 22% of U.S. heavy industrial imports and 70% of nearly 4 million tons of U.S. aluminum imports. That is leverage, whether anyone wants to admit it or not. And according to your reference material, Canada is already looking outward. Prime Minister Mark Carney visited Beijing on January 12, 2026, seeking to expand trade relationships as America becomes, in his words, no longer a reliable partner. That is a geopolitical signal, and it lands like a warning flare. Because once a partner starts building alternatives, you don't just lose a negotiation. You lose the ability to assume the system will snap back to normal. And now you can see the real escalation. This is no longer a dispute about tariffs or machinery. It's a test of whether North America remains a shared industrial platform or becomes a set of rival choke points. And the next part is the moment where the future opens up into 3 paths, none of them comfortable.